All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our summer version of PPA 555, Public Budgeting and Finance. It's 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started so we don't spend too much of your time this evening. We have, I think, 16 folks enrolled in the class, so we're short about 3 or 4 people. I'm sure they'll be joining us along the way, but we'll go ahead and get started to save some of your time. My name is Dr. Powell, and I'm the instructor for the course. If you have not had me in class yet in the program, it's good to meet you. Some of you, I know I recognize a few names on the roster, so you had the misfortune of having me in class before. I'll say to you, welcome back. I've been teaching public budgeting and finance now for, well, I guess since 1996. So I'll let you do the math on that one. But I've been teaching this class for quite a while. This, I think, may be my swan song for public budgeting and finance, at least teaching it in this program. I think I may be handing the duties off next summer to Dr. Zhao, who is taking over as our public budgeting and finance guru now that Dr. Bill Moore is retiring from the program. So I think this may be my last summer teaching the course, but I have been teaching for quite a while. I've taught it almost every year that I've been here at Long Beach, and I'm moving into my 23rd year here on faculty. So been doing it for quite a while, but welcome to the course. I thought what we would do tonight is we'll split our session up into 2 halves. The first half of the session, we will talk about the course, go through the syllabus, talk a bit about some of the class requirements, make sure everyone is on the same page with what we are doing, why we are doing it, when we're doing it, how we're doing it, answer any questions you may have about the course itself. Then we'll take a break, and then after the break in the second half of class, we will get started with some of our substantive material. We will do an introduction to public finance and budgeting, talk about some of those issues that you've probably already talked about in your microeconomics course, either at the undergraduate level or if you took it here in our program, PPA 518, and kind of set the stage then for moving forward with our remaining weeks in the course. So as you know, this is a summer course, and as a summer course, it is an accelerated version of budgeting, which means that we're going to do all of our work within 6 weeks. And so we're starting up tonight, and then we will finish up our work together as a class by June 30th. So we have 6 weeks together to cover the same material that you would normally cover if you took this course in fall or spring semester in the 15-week variety. So we don't cut out any information for the summer course. We just do the information in a much more accelerated version. So we will cover a lot of information. We'll do it relatively quickly, but it is doable. I've been teaching in this version now, like I said, for many, many summers, and it has worked out well. So I don't anticipate any problem getting through our material in these 6 weeks. One of the casualties of covering this material in only 6 weeks is that we tend to end up being a little more lecture heavy than we are in terms of doing breakout groups. I usually like to do breakout groups in a lot of my courses. We just oftentimes don't have the time to do it here in this course because it's a lot of material for only 6 weeks. So that's the drawback. You get to listen to me a little bit more than you would have to in some of the other courses that I teach. I will get to know you as we move through our course together. You've probably already, if you looked at the syllabus, noticed that I have an introduction assignment for you on a Canvas essay where you'll just give me a paragraph or two about you, what you do, why you were in the program, what you hope to achieve and get out of the class. Just a real quick 1 or 2 paragraph introduction to you so we can all learn a little bit more about you. And so we'll do that with that introductory post. That introductory post, which is due next Monday, is not graded. So it's just allow you to kind of get to know each other in the class. So we'll be spending 6 weeks together. So it's nice if we can kind of get to know each other a little bit. Before we jump into the syllabus and talking about the course, let me remind you that all these sessions are recorded. So usually by the next day, so by Wednesday, I should have the recordings ready to go, and I will post those onto our Canvas site. So if for any reason you have to miss our Tuesday night session, I do not take attendance, and so that's certainly, you won't lose any points if you cannot be here, if you have work or family obligations. But you can go and watch the recording, and then if you have any questions after watching the recording, you can feel free to ask me any of those questions. If you just want a refresher, you're here on Tuesday night, but you just want a refresher on some of the material, the recordings will be there for you to watch as well. So I'll have those recordings up and ready to go by Wednesday morning. There'll be closed captioning on those as well. And so I usually upload them to YouTube, and then I will place a link to the YouTube video in our Canvas site. Speaking of Canvas, you've probably noticed that the entire program, and really the entire university, has now moved from Beachboard to Canvas. And that move is official as of this summer. You may have had some courses in the spring or even maybe last fall that already made the transition to Canvas. I know for my stateside courses, I made that transition this past spring. But as of this summer, everyone in every course across campus is now working in Canvas. So if this is your first course dealing with Canvas, it's a very easy interface to get used to. I think in many ways, it's actually easier than Beachboard. And once we go through our syllabus, then before we take our break tonight, I'll take you on to the Canvas site. If you haven't had a chance to look around the Canvas site yet, I'll give you a little mini tour of the Canvas site, show you how it's set up, show you where you can create all the resources that you need in order to complete the assignments in the course. And then I also have some additional documents for your own edification up there, such as examples of different types of budgets and things like that. And I've provided that for you on the Canvas site. But I'll take you on a little mini tour of our Canvas site just in a little bit. So that's my very brief introduction. Again, I've been here at Cal State Long Beach for quite a while now. I'm starting my 23rd year. I spent 10 years here as department chair, and I've spent 18 years now as the director of the distance learning MPA program. Before arriving here at Long Beach, I taught for a year on the faculty at Florida Gulf Coast University. I don't know if everyone's heard of Florida Gulf Coast before, but it's located in Fort Myers. It is one of, I think it's still the newest state university in the state of Florida. It opened its doors in 1997. I arrived on campus in 2000, so 3 years after it started offering courses. When I got there, we had fewer than 1,000 students on campus. Now I think their enrollment is pushing about 20,000. And it is a very vibrant, alive and well state campus in the state of Florida. When I was there, I taught the MPA program. I also started an undergraduate program in political science that is still enrolling students, and actually is one of the more popular majors on campus now. Before going to Florida, I started my academic career for 4 years at Eastern Illinois University in lovely, scenic Charleston, Illinois, right there in the middle of central Illinois, surrounded by cornfields. It was a state university with an enrollment of about 15 or 16,000, teaching primarily American government and public administration courses. In fact, the very first course that I taught at Eastern Illinois was public budgeting. And so it's been many, many years that I've been teaching this course. So that's a little bit about me. Hopefully on the screen, you're able to see the syllabus for our course. If you can't see that, let me know, but I'm sharing my screen, so hopefully you're able to see it. So let's spend a few minutes going through the syllabus, and I'm not going to read the syllabus word for word. I just want to hit some of the highlights to make sure that we all understand what we are doing and that everyone's on the same page as we start out our 6 weeks together. So again, this is a summer class, a 6-week course. So we begin tonight, and our official last day of summer session 1 is June 30th. It's kind of weird here at Long Beach in that we technically have 3 summer sessions, 1, 2, and 3. But here in PPA, we only offer courses in the first summer session or the 3rd summer session, and on rare occasions throughout the entire summer for 12 weeks. So we really don't offer anything in summer session 2. So all of our courses tend to be summer session 1 or summer session 3. If you are taking some summer session 3 courses, those start up as soon as summer session 1 is over. After, I believe it's the July 4th weekend, you then move right into your summer session 3 course. Again, you know who I am, you know the meeting time, you've got the Zoom link, we've got almost everyone here, maybe absent one person, so everyone knows how to log in. We will be doing these synchronous sessions every Tuesday night. So tonight, May 30th, June 6th, June 13th, June 20th, and then our final session will be on June 27th. We start up at 6 o'clock. We are scheduled to go to 8:45. Some evenings we'll probably be pushing 8:45. Other evenings we may get out a little bit early. It really depends upon kind of the pacing of the material that we cover throughout our 6 weeks together. Since this is a virtual course, and both of the courses I'm doing this summer are online courses, my office hours are also virtual. I will be on campus a couple of days in the month of June because I'm serving on a search committee for an associate dean position, and we're going to be doing some on-campus interviewing. So I don't know yet what those dates will be, but a couple of dates I will be on campus. But for the most part, all my office hours will be virtual. So if you need to contact me, send me an email. My email is right there on the syllabus. I also have my phone number on there, but I highly recommend you use email as opposed to my voicemail. I have voicemail. I can technically access it remotely, but I'm notoriously bad at returning voicemail messages. If you email me, I have all my emails pushed directly to my phone, and so I'll get your email and I will respond almost always within 24 hours, sometimes within an hour or two. So if you need to contact me through my email. Now, as we go through the syllabus, if you have any questions at all, or you need any clarifications, feel free to use the meeting chat, and I've got that open. I'll be monitoring that throughout our evening together tonight. If you're more comfortable using your microphone, you can always do that as well. But feel free to ask questions, or if you need any clarifications or anything seems unclear as we go through our syllabus. So you know what the course is. It's public budgeting and finance, and technically there is a prerequisite for this course. The expectation is that you will have taken either a microeconomics course at the undergraduate level, or you would have taken PPA 518 microeconomics for public administrators. That is a prerequisite for being in this course, completing one of those courses with a grade of C or better. If you have not met that prerequisite, you're under no obligation to tell me at this point. You already have the permit, you're already in the course, and so you don't have to tell me if you don't have it. I'm going to assume everyone does have that prerequisite. Dr. Moore and I sometimes disagree a little bit about the importance of that prerequisite. He feels it's absolutely vital for the 555 course. I don't think it's quite as vital because we will spend time covering principles of microeconomics in our discussion of Introduction to Public Finance and Budgeting, which we're going to do tonight. So a lot of that important information you would have gotten in that course, we're going to review that information tonight. So again, you're under no obligation to tell me if you have not completed that prerequisite. I'm just going to assume everybody has. So in terms of the objectives for this course, as you know, I'm sure you know by now, we are a NASPA accredited program, which means we have national accreditation. NASPA is the accrediting body for MPA and MPP programs, not just nationwide, but also worldwide. And they have several programs that are now accredited in China, in Vietnam, in Italy, all across the country, and all across the world. It's important to be a NASPA accredited program because all NASPA accredited programs are reviewed by NASPA to make sure that they are covering what are called the 5 universal required competencies. And I've listed those 5 universal required competencies there on our syllabus. URC number 1 is to lead and manage in the public interest. Second required competency is the ability to participate in and contribute to the policy process. The third competency is to analyze, synthesize, think critically, solve problems, and make evidence-informed decisions in a complex and dynamic environment. That's a mouthful, but that's the third competency. Fourth competency is to articulate, apply, and advance a public service perspective. And the fifth competency is to communicate and interact productively in culturally responsive ways with a diverse and changing workforce and society at large. So whenever you leave this MPA program, you should be able to demonstrate those 5 universal required competencies. And you will do that in your PPA 697 course as you complete your 5 required case studies. But it's important for us as a program to demonstrate where these universal required competencies are provided within the core courses in the MPA program. So as a core course in the program, we have 7 course learning objectives that are all tied back to 2 of those universal required competencies. So our first course objective is to be able to correctly identify budget formats. That links up with universal competency number 1, the ability to lead and manage in the public interest. If you cannot correctly identify budget formats, it's going to be difficult for you to lead an organization that's heavily dependent upon budgets and upon fiscal resources. Second objective for this course is to be able to evaluate the fiscal solvency of a local government. You will get the opportunity to do that in both your pre-instructional as well as your post-instructional assignments. And that links directly to required competency number 3, because you're doing analysis in determining the fiscal solvency of a local government. In this course, we will go through several different indicators of fiscal solvency. I'll introduce you to Brown's fiscal solvency indicators. I'll introduce you to Wang, Dennis, and Tu's fiscal solvency indicators, and you'll have an opportunity to apply those indicators to assess fiscal solvency. The third course learning objective is to analyze sources of revenue. That again links back to competency number 3. Fourth learning objective is to articulate the need for fund-based accounting and different accounting methods. That links back to number 1, the ability to lead and manage in organizations. The fifth learning objective, to evaluate comprehensive financial reports. That's an analysis skill, and so that links back to number 3. Number 6 learning objective, analyze different types of debt mechanisms and capital budgeting. Since we're doing analysis, that links directly back to universal competency number 3 as well. And then finally, the 7th objective, to create budgets based on assignment requirements. The ability to create a budget is inherent within your ability to effectively lead an organization. So that then links back to required competency number 1. But I just think it's important for us to crosswalk between the objectives in the individual course and those universal competencies that we are being held accountable for by NASPA in the accreditation process. If you weren't aware, this was what we consider to be our site visit year. We had a NASPA site visit team that came to visit us back in March, I think early March. They then provided a report, and then the accreditation body known as COPRA, which is part of NASPA, that's a Commission on Peer Review and Accreditation, they will then issue their final decision about a new 7-year accreditation for the program sometime next month in June. And so once that happens, we'll then be reaccredited for an additional 7 years, which will then take us through 2030, at which point in time we will go through the accreditation process again. And chances are, if I do my math correctly, I'll probably be around for that one as well. And I'm assuming the 2030 reaccreditation should probably be my last one on faculty here. Nature of the course. This is a 6-week course. It is an online course, so all of our Tuesday sessions are done via Zoom, but we still have to be accountable for contact hours. There's an expectation, what are called the Carnegie hours, that you're expected to have 45 instructor-led contact hours with every single course in a program. So to meet that 45-hour requirement, we not only have our 2-hour and 45-minute sessions on every Tuesday evening through Zoom, but then we also have those Canvas essays, the asynchronous requirement of the course. So every week you will be completing these Canvas essays. Those Canvas essays are done through the discussion board feature on our Canvas site. And those Canvas essays then make up for the remainder of those 45 instructor-led contact hours. But I'll talk more about the Canvas essays in a few minutes. This course really naturally breaks into two main parts. The first segment of the course will look at the basics of budget preparation and analysis. We'll cover topics such as budget processes. I will take you through the federal budget process, not because I want to torture you, but because state and local budget processes tend to kind of piggyback on how the federal government does it. So we'll go through at least the highlights of the federal budget process. We'll also talk about some of the highlights of the California state budget process as well. I will introduce you to different budget formats and the four main formats that we will cover this semester: line item, performance-based, program-based, and zero-based. I'll show you examples of each of those. We'll talk about their advantages and their disadvantages, situations where one may be more appropriate than in other situations. We will also talk about how we analyze budgets. And so I'll take you through some different methods we can use for revenue forecasting and expenditure estimation. We'll talk about very simple types of univariate approaches. We'll talk about bivariate approaches. We'll talk about multivariate approaches. But we'll do all of that from kind of the 30,000-foot level, in that I'm not going to quiz you on actually doing these types of calculations. Rather, we're going to talk about how those calculations are done and in which situation for revenue forecasting you'd want to use one approach as compared to another approach. Then we also talk about capital budgeting and debt management. We'll talk about how we fund those buildings, those fleets of police vehicles, those long-term high price tag capital projects, how we go about funding those, how we put together capital improvement plans, and how we then use those capital improvement plans to then create our capital budgets. Then the second section of the semester will then look more at revenues and expenditures. We'll talk about the structure and politics of various types of taxes. We'll go through property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes. We'll talk about how you evaluate those different types of sources of revenue. We'll talk about non-tax sources of revenue as well, like user fees and user charges. We'll also talk about intergovernmental sources of revenue in terms of grants and aid and their advantages, their disadvantages, different types of grants and how different types of grants work. And that will be essentially be then the second half of our semester together. We try to make everything build upon the previous week, so it's important that you stay up to date on the material, stay up to date on the readings and assignments, because everything kind of builds toward that final week together. Since we are only a 6-week course, we have a limited amount of time, and I understand that you have work obligations. I understand you have family obligations. And so I don't want to inundate you with unnecessary reading. So we only have one main textbook for this course, and that's Fiscal Administration Analysis and Applications for the Public Sector by John Mikesell. You can use any version. There's a question in text chat about the edition of the book to use. You can use any version of the textbook that you would like. And the reason why I'm doing that is it's twofold. One reason is that it's a very expensive textbook. And so the newest version of the textbook is expensive. It's well over $200. And I want to save you a little bit of money, because if you get an older version, you can literally get it for pennies on the dollar. And there's also the rumor out there that you can find a free PDF version of a former edition of the textbook online as well. So you can look around for that. But if you get an older version of the textbook, it's going to save you a lot of money. Typically what happens is whenever publishers and authors decide that they are going to come up with a new version of a textbook, the substance of the textbook typically remains the same. There may be some changes here and there around the margins, but the basic backbone of the textbook is going to be the same. It's just a way in which publishers can make a little bit more money by offering a new edition of the textbook. But the second reason why I say you can use any edition that you would want to use is that there will be no more versions of this textbook that are going to be published. And so this is kind of the end of it with this textbook, which is unfortunate because I have for years looked around for a better textbook for this class. And over my entire career of teaching this course, I have never been able to find a better textbook than John Mikesell's. John Mikesell has passed away. He retired and then passed away. And so therefore there will be no more versions of the textbook. So it's probably fortunate that this is the last time I'm probably teaching public budgeting, because I think this will probably be the last semester where it is readily available. But yeah, feel free to share resources in terms of getting the textbook. As Dan says, Cengage also has a $38 ebook version of it. I know Chegg oftentimes has rentals of the textbook that are very cheap, usually about $30 or $40. And so they are out there, they are available at a much reduced cost. And so whatever version you can get, save yourself some money, will certainly get the job done. But it is a great textbook. It's a very comprehensive textbook, and it's also a very readable textbook as well. There are calculations that Mikesell goes through in the textbook that we're not going to get too hung up on a lot of those calculations, because a lot of those formulas we can do in Excel, and we don't need to actually sit down and calculate these things by hand anymore. So we're going to be dealing with it more from a theoretical perspective, as opposed to sitting down and actually crunching our way through formulas. And so don't get too hung up on the formulas in the Mikesell book. We're going to deal with it much more in a theoretical type of perspective. But it is a great textbook, and it really does a nice job of covering all the material for the course. Danny, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, so I was just gonna mention, so there is an ebook, and there's also like different variations of the book, but it's the same exact book, but it's called Fiscal Administration, and it's the same thing. So I know in the syllabus it's titled Analysis and Applications for the Public Sector, but there's also a Fiscal Administration, which is the same exact book.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And yeah, it's all over the place online, so you'll be able to get it, even though it is going to be going out of print in the near future. But and John Mikesell is someone I was introduced to. John Mikesell back in my doctoral program when I took my public budgeting course, and my dissertation chair who taught the course was a co-author with John Mikesell, and so we ended up having the opportunity to read a lot of his manuscripts that he was just writing before they actually even got published. And one of the manuscripts we had the opportunity to use in that course was City Finances, City Futures, which was kind of based upon a lot of the concepts from the fiscal administration textbook, but it we got to read it before it actually went to print. And so I've been using John Mikesell for many, many years. He's a very well-known scholar, or was a very well-known scholar in public budgeting and finance. I believe most of his career, I believe, was at Indiana University, Bloomington. So a great textbook, and one that I think will serve us very well in the course. Evaluation criteria, this is always, I know, an important consideration for every class. What types of assignments will you be doing, and how will they be evaluated? Again, we are a 6-week course, and so we really speed through this material relatively quickly. And I don't want to, not only do I not want to inundate you with readings, I also don't want to inundate you with a lot of work. So I want the work that we do to actually be meaningful, and to actually help you in terms of doing budgeting, if you will, on a daily basis once you are outside of the program. So I've kept the assignments to a minimum. As you can see, we have a pre-instructional assignment. We are a core course in the program. And so several years ago, back my first go around as chair back, I think in 2007, I put together our assessment system of student learning outcomes that we're still using today. So we started in 2007. So 16 years later, it's still going strong. It's something that's been used by other universities as well. I know that the University of Utah is currently using our assessment system. University of West Georgia is using it. The former chair of the program at Westchester University in Pennsylvania actually came out to campus about 10 years ago to see firsthand how we did assessment, and basically took our assessment system took it with him and implemented in the MPA program at Westchester in Pennsylvania. So it's something that not only we are doing, but a lot of other programs around the country are doing it as well, which means every one of our core courses should have a pre and a post-instructional assignment. Those are your bookend assignments for each of your core courses, with the exception of 500 and 697. So for this course, for human resource management, for organization theory, for policy analysis and research methods, for those 5 courses, each of those courses should have a designated pre-instructional and a designated post-instructional assignment. Our pre-instructional assignment in this class requires that you go out there and obtain a copy of a city budget. And this is much easier done today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Today, just about every city has an electronic version of their budget on their website. It's as simple as just going to the city's website, downloading the budget, and you got it. So obtain a city budget, and then after you read that city budget, I have 8 very simple questions that you will be answering based on that budget for this pre-instructional assignment. And to make it a little bit easier to talk about, give me a second here, find my cursor. Let's go down to the end of the syllabus. At the end of the syllabus, I have some specific information about the pre-instructional assignment here. So as you'll see here down near the end of the syllabus, here's your description of the pre-instruction assignment. Again, you're going to go out there and get a city budget, read that city budget, and analyze it for the purpose of answering the following 8 questions. Question number 1, what type of budget format is represented by this budget? Now, this is a pre-instructional assignment, so it means that you should not use any information from the class. Don't use any information from the textbook. Don't go out there to the library and get information. The only information I want you to use for this pre-instructional assignment is what you currently already know about budgets. That is very important because this is purely an assessment assignment. There are no right or wrong answers in the assignment. The pre-instructional assignment will be graded based upon, did you turn it in or did you not turn it in? It's very much a credit, no credit, probably some of the easiest 10 points that you'll ever get in any graduate course in your entire graduate career. Dammy, go ahead.
Since it is budget season, do you want the current proposed budget or the one from last fiscal or this current fiscal year?
I would get the proposed budget. Yeah, get the proposed budget because that will tell you what the city is planning on doing in the next fiscal year. And that's a great question. That would be the preferred approach. Now, if you can't get their proposed budget, you have to get the enacted budget. That's fine as well. Either one will work. But if you have a choice, the proposed budget probably would be the one that you would want to select. It's a great question. So since you're not using any information except what you already know about budgets, I know people come into this class with a variety of different budgeting backgrounds. I always tell my classes, one of the first versions of this course I taught back in, I won't tell you the year, but it was, well, I had one student who was a capital budget manager for a major metropolitan transit authority. And so this person was in charge of over $500 million in capital projects. This person had a lot of experience working with budgets, creating budgets, analyzing budgets, forecasting revenue, had a lot of experience. On the other end of the spectrum, I have a lot of people who come into the course who've never dealt with a public budget before. Their budgeting experience, the extent of that is essentially balancing their personal checkbook. Everyone can succeed in this class, and so I don't assume any budgeting information. So if you have not dealt with a budget before, you don't know what budget formats look like, that's fine. Your answer to question number 1 could be, I do not have the information to answer the question. That's a valid answer to question number 1, because it shows me where you are at currently in terms of your knowledge of public budgets. So that's an absolutely fine answer to have. However, if you've dealt with budgets before and you know what the budget formats are, you know how to identify them, then you can go ahead and answer that question. Tell me what budget format is represented by the city budget you are looking at. So again, your answer is going to depend upon how much experience you have in the world of budgeting. Second question then after you read your budget is, what information did you use to arrive at this answer? So if you're telling me this is a performance-based budget, why is there performance-based budget? What information led you to that conclusion? Again, if you answered number one, I don't have the information to answer this question, then you're going to have the same answer then for number two. Question three, what are the strengths of this type of a budget? For example, is it easy to follow? What are some of the strengths of the budget itself? You can probably answer this question even if you don't have a whole lot of budgeting experience. If it was an easy budget to get through, it made sense. There are a lot of tables and a lot of graphs that helped the reader understand the budget. Clearly, that would be a strength of the budget. Next question, the relay question, well, then what are the weaknesses of this type of budget? Is it difficult to understand? Is it based upon a lot of jargon and a lot of numbers? So what are some of the weaknesses? So I think even though not everyone can answer questions 1 and 2, I think everyone probably can answer questions 3 and 4. Question 5, everyone can answer as well. What are the 3 major sources of revenue for the city? And what I want you to do with number 5 is to create a very simple table. In the first column, you will list the revenue source by name. So it might be property taxes, might be local option sales taxes, but list the name of the source of revenue. Then in the second column, list the amount of revenue derived from that source. And then the third column, you'll list the percentage of total revenue that is coming from that source. So your first line might be property tax. These, in the first column, second column might be, $15.5 million. And the third column could be, it's 30% of the total revenue generated by the city. Then you move down to your second row, which will then be your second largest source of revenue, then your third largest source of revenue. Again, everyone should be able to answer this because this is a pretty straightforward type of question. A good place to get this information will be in the budget summary. Budgets usually have a budget message, and then they usually have a good summary section. So when you are selecting your city budget, if you don't really have any city that you have a burning desire to analyze their budget, look around at a few city budgets and pick out the one that has a good summary section with nice pie charts and tables and a summary section that really presents this information in a very straightforward way. If you select the right budget with a really good budget summary, the city's probably already done this work for you. They'll probably have a pie chart there listing the major sources of revenue, the percentage of total revenue from those sources, the total amount of revenue from each of those sources. That will probably already present it to you in that budget summary. So the 3 major sources of revenue, the amount generated from each of those sources, and then the percentage of total revenue derived from each of those 3 sources of revenue. Then you're going to do the same thing for question number 6, only for expenditures. And so you'll create another very simple table. First column, the object of expenditure. Second column, the amount spent on that expenditure. And the third column, the percentage of total expenditures that are being spent on that object of expenditure. Just give you a little hint, for a lot of cities in California, the #1 expenditure tends to be public safety. That usually is the top expenditure for most cities. Not for all, but that is for most cities. Again, that's information that you can find pretty readily in the budget summary if your city has a good summary section to their budget. So everyone should be able to provide me with a revenue table in number 5 and an expenditure table in number 6. Number 7 is a more difficult question. Is the city fiscally solvent? Now, reading the budget only gives you a small picture of fiscal solvency. You have not done the comprehensive financial report yet. We'll get to that later on in the course. So you're only getting a little snapshot to answer the question of fiscal solvency. But if you have experience working with budgets and you've worked on fiscal solvency before, you can go ahead and answer that question. If you don't know how to assess the fiscal solvency of a city, which is true for probably the majority of folks in the class, you can again say, I do not have the information to answer that question. And then question 8, what information did you use to arrive at the answer that you gave me in number 7 in terms of fiscal solvency? Essentially, how do you know the city is fiscally solvent? What indicators did you use? And if you answered, I don't have the information, number 7, you can repeat that answer then in number 8. But again, this is a benign assessment type of an assignment. It just shows me where you are currently in terms of what you know about budgeting. There are no right or wrong answers. You turn the assignment in, you will get 10 out of 10 points on the assignment. But that's what we're going to consider to be our pre-instructional assignment. As you can see in our syllabus, the pre-instructional assignment is worth 10 points. And again, it's a credit, no credit. Either you turn it in, get 10 points, or you don't turn it in and you don't get the 10 points. But let me scroll back up really quickly, and then I'm gonna make you dizzy because I'm gonna be going right back down the bottom of the syllabus again. So that's what we call our pre-instructional assignment for 10 points. Then the bookend assignment, as in all of your core courses, hopefully, is the post-instructional assignment. And for this course, the post-instructional assignment is a 2-part post-instructional assignment. So let's go right back down to the bottom of the syllabus again. And here are your instructions for your post-instructional assignment. Now, once we finish talking about the syllabus, I will show you some of the specific documents you are going to be using in doing part 2 of the post-instructional assignment. But we're going to hold off on that until we're done with the syllabus, just for ease of sharing of screens. I don't want to stop this share and start another share and jump back and forth. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. But the purpose of this post-instructional assignment is twofold. The first part of the post-instructional assignment is a redo of the pre-instructional assignment. So you'll take that same city budget that you use in your pre-instructional, and you will answer those 8 questions again. Now, in doing the post-instructional assignment, you are to use all the information that you have at your disposal. So use all the information that you have acquired in this course, the information from Mike Sell's textbook, use all the information you've gotten from this course in re-answering those 8 questions. A good way to do this that I think is really handy is take your pre-instructional assignment, and then when you answer these 8 questions again on the post-instructional, just answer them in a different color. And so just maybe use blue or use red for your post-instructional answers. So we can then compare how you answered them on the pre-instructional versus how you answer them on the post-instructional after you have covered all the information in the course. So for the post-instructional part 1, you can no longer say, I do not have the information to answer the question. That's no longer a valid answer because you have been provided with the information that should allow you to answer those questions. So all 8 questions need to be answered on the part 1 of the post-instructional assignment. And that's worth 10 points. Then in part 2, you're going to be working through an exercise that I'm providing for you that will afford you the opportunity to put together a very simple line item budget. At the very least, whenever anyone leaves a public budgeting class, you should at the very least be able to put together a rudimentary line item budget. And so that's what we're getting at here with part 2 of the post-instructional assignment. I use an exercise from the Public Administration Workbook by Mark Huddleston. It's an exercise, it's from a workbook that was published several years ago, but every few years they go through a revision of it, and I'm always one of the reviewers on it. And one of the nice things about being a reviewer on a textbook is that as compensation for doing the review, you're then allowed to use content from the textbook in your courses without copyright issues. And so that's why I'm able to use this assignment from the Public Administration Workbook by Mark Huddleston. I will show you that assignment in just a second, but essentially what you're going to do in part 2 of the post-instructional is you will take a library budget, a countywide library budget, and you will consolidate that budget according to several different parameters that you are given in the assignment. So there are several different things you have to adhere to as you consolidate this together into a consolidated line item budget. So for part 2, what you're going to be turning in, and this will all make more sense in a few minutes, but what you're going to be turning in is you'll be turning in an Excel spreadsheet with your consolidated budget, countywide library budget, and then you'll also be submitting your justifications for the cuts that you have made in creating that consolidated budget. one of the requirements of the assignment is that in consolidating the county library budget, you have to reduce overall spending by at least 3%. So by reducing spending by 3%, it means you're going to have to make some cuts. So you'll have to provide me with justifications for those cuts. So just to clarify, part one of the post-instructional assignment is just a redo of the pre-instructional assignment. Part two of the post-instructional assignment will be the creation of this consolidated line item budget for a county library, and then your justifications for why you made the cuts you made to reduce the spending in the budget by at least 3%. But again, I'll show you the documents you're going to be using in a few minutes for the post-instructional, and then all the puzzle pieces will all fall in place and they'll become much clearer. But just at this point now, just to let you know, there is that post-instructional assignment, two-part post-instructional assignment. Part one is worth 10 points, and then part two of the post-instructional assignment is worth 80 points. There is a final exam in this course, but the final exam is not done in class. What I will do is I will make the final examination available to you at least 2 weeks before it is due, and you'll have the opportunity to work on that on your own. You can use all the material from the class in answering the questions on the final exam. And the final exam is really much more of an assessment. So what I do is I provide you with 5 different scenarios. You will then have 2 questions related to each of those scenarios. You will take the information from the class and you will then apply them to answer those questions. It's a concise type of final assessment in that your answers to each of those questions can be a paragraph or 2 paragraphs. It doesn't have to be terribly long, but 5 scenarios, 2 questions related to each scenario. So a grand total of 10 questions on the quote unquote final examination. But it is a scenario-based type of exam. That again, I'll make available to you through our Canvas site at least 2 weeks before the due date for the exam. And then our asynchronous component, as I mentioned before, are our Canvas discussion postings. We have a total of 5 graded Canvas postings, 20 points for each one of those, for a total of 100 points. You add everything up and you end up with a total of 300 points for our 6 weeks together. The grading scale, as you know, here at Long Beach, we don't have pluses or minuses, and so it's a 90, 80, 70, 60 type of split. As usual with most graduate level classes, the grades usually tend to cluster around the A and the B level. You kind of really have to go out of your way to get anything below a C in this class. Means you're not turning in assignments, but you turn in all the assignments, you give it the old graduate school try, and I have very, very high faith that you'll be able to pass the class. I wish we had pluses and minuses, but it gets voted down every single time it's put up to a vote university-wide, so we still do not have a plus or minus grading system. I've got some really basic grading rubrics there for each one of the assignments. Again, the pre-instructional is real straightforward. There are no right or wrong answers to that. I've discussed the post-instructional and we'll discuss it again once we're done talking about our syllabus, and I'll share the files that you're going to be using to complete that. But again, the part 1 of the post-instructional is worth 10 points. Part 2 of the post-instructional is then worth 80 points, and you'll see how the points are then distributed. Now let's talk a little bit about our Canvas postings and how those are going to work. Again, this is the asynchronous portion of the course, and so I provide you with a prompt for each one of those Canvas essays. You will respond to my prompt and then also respond to 2 of your classmates. So you'll end up having 3 different posts for each week for your graded Canvas essays. Now, for your introduction, it's not graded. You don't have to respond to your classmates for that. Just give me a brief introduction. That's what's due for next Monday. But for the remaining 5 Canvas essays, you will have to give me a response to my prompt and then respond to 2 of your classmates. Now, I am a very big believer in parsimony. I think we're a public administration program, and as a public administration program, we need to be as concise and to the point as possible. So in your answers, to the Canvas essay prompts, I'm looking at maybe a couple of paragraphs. It doesn't have to be terribly long at all. And then in your responses to your classmates, each of those responses, a paragraph is certainly enough to get the job done. So be as concise and parsimonious as you can be. But again, just remember, you're going to have 3 posts for each week, 1 response to me, and then responses to 2 of your classmates. And as we go into the Canvas site later on tonight, I'll show you what each one of those prompts are, and you'll kind of get an idea of what I'm asking you to do in each one of those Canvas essays. As I mentioned, the final assessment/exam, it's a scenario-based exam. You're going to have 5 scenarios, 2 questions related to each of those scenarios. So again, I tried to keep the assignments as reasonable as possible so that they have value in terms of quality, but much more of an emphasis on quality as opposed to quantity of work. So what are we going to cover this semester, and when are we going to cover it? Tonight, obviously, we're going through a review of the syllabus and the course itself. The first half of class tonight. Second half of class, we'll start talking about our introduction to public finance and budgeting. We'll talk about definitions of budgets. We'll talk about the reason why we have public as compared to private expenditures. We'll talk about the different characteristics of public versus private goods. We'll talk about some of the considerations we go through in creating public budgets and going from individual preferences to the societal preferences that are incorporated within a society's budget. Do all that kind of introductory information then in the second half of class tonight. Then your introductory post is due by midnight next Monday on May 29th. Again, it's not graded, just a little introduction about you and who you are and kind of why you are here. The next week on May 30th session, we will get into a discussion of the processes of budgeting. I'll take you through the federal budget process. I'll take you through the California state budget process. We'll do that in the first half of class. Then the second half of class, we'll get into the 4 primary budget formats. I'll show you examples of those. We'll talk about their advantages, their disadvantages, and situations when we'd want to use one as compared to another. Then your first graded Canvas essay is then due by Monday midnight on Monday, June 5th, along with responses to 2 of your classmates. Then week 3 on June 6th, we'll get into analysis and accounting. The first half of the class will deal with budget analysis. We'll talk about the different purposes, why we analyze budgets for things like revenue forecasting, expenditure estimation, calculating costs of capital projects and creating capital improvement plans. We'll talk about all the different reasons why we do budget analysis, and then different discrete analytical tools that can be used for each one of those processes or each one of those purposes. Then the second half of class, we'll talk about everyone's favorite topic, which is government accounting and financial reporting. We'll go through reading a comprehensive annual financial report, and we'll talk about the importance of a comprehensive annual financial report. They used to go by the name CAFR. Now we oftentimes call them annual comprehensive financial reports. And so now the guidance is to refer to them as ACFRs as opposed to CAFRs. So we'll go through the reading of an annual comprehensive financial report. I'll show you the major sections of those reports and what we're looking at in terms of assessing fiscal solvency. We'll talk about the different principles of government accounting. We will talk about double entry accounting. We'll talk about fund-based accounting. I'll introduce you to the different types of funds that government organizations typically use and why they use those different types of funds. You have your second Canvas essay and responses to classmates due then by midnight on June 12th. And then that pre-instructional assignment is then also due by midnight on June 12th as well. Then we'll get into week number 4, which is our meeting on June 13th. We'll talk about revenue estimation, public expenditures, but spend most of our time talking about capital budgeting and debt management. We'll talk about why state and local governments maintain a separate capital budget separate from their operating budgets. We'll talk about how we go about putting together different capital budgets. We'll talk about the capital improvement planning process and capital improvement plans. We'll then also talk about different ways in which we fund capital projects through the use of debt. We'll talk about different types of bonds, their advantages and their disadvantages. We'll talk about short-term borrowing mechanisms such as notes and their advantages and their disadvantages as well. Then you have your third Canvas essay and responses due then by midnight on June 18th. Then we'll move into week number 5 on June 20th. We'll turn our attention to taxation. We'll talk about different forms of taxation, property, income, sales taxes, their advantages, their disadvantages. And we'll talk about how they specifically work here in the state of California. As many of you probably know, here in California, we have a relatively unique property tax system through Proposition 13. We use what's called a welcome stranger approach, which is fundamentally different than what a lot of other states use around the country. We'll talk about how that works. We'll talk about the different evaluative criteria. How do we evaluate whether to use an income tax or a property tax or a sales tax? We'll then also talk about some non-tax sources of revenue. Because one major phenomenon here in California after Proposition 13 in 1978 is we saw Proposition 13 push a lot of local governments away from using the property tax and push them more toward replacing property tax revenue with non-tax sources of revenue. So things like user fees, user charges, hotel taxes, things such as that. So we'll talk about those types of tax, non-tax sources of revenue. Then you'll have your fourth Canvas essay and responses due by midnight, and then on June 26th, and your post-instructional assignment parts 1 and 2 will then also be due by midnight on June 26th as well. Then our final Zoom session together will be on June 27th. We will talk about revenue collection and intergovernmental fiscal relations. We'll talk about different types of grants and their advantages and disadvantages. We'll then also talk about mandates and the fiscal implications of unfunded and partially funded mandates. We'll then wrap everything up in a course conclusion, hopefully put a nice big bow on everything we've talked about for the 6 weeks. Your fifth and final Canvas essay and responses will then be due by midnight on June 30th, and your final examination will then also be due by midnight on June 30th. Then by midnight on June 30th, we are done. The class is then over. I'll calculate the final grades. I'll upload your final grades into the system, and you can then move onward and upward for any classes you're taking in summer session 3, or then just take the rest of the summer off and just wait until beginning of fall semester. I've got the due dates here on the syllabus just for one-stop shopping to make it a little bit easier for you. I hope I have them all correct, but pre-instructional assignment is due by midnight on June 12th. Post-instructional assignments due by midnight on June 26th. That looks a little funky, but June 26th. Final assessment then due by midnight on June 30th. And then due date for your Canvas essays, your introductory post is due by midnight on May 29th. And then you can see the due dates for each of your 5 graded Canvas essays. So that's what we're going to be covering and when we are going to be covering the information. The rest of the syllabus, then we have some disclaimers on there, some more important than others, but policy on late assignments, everything's due by the scheduled due date. I provided the due dates here in the syllabus for you, so everyone should know what the due dates are. If something does get turned in late without an extension, then there is a 10% penalty per 24 hours that an assignment is late. That includes your discussion assignments as well. Now, I do understand that life intervenes, and that does happen on occasion. If life intervenes for you and you have some good, compelling reason why you cannot turn something in on time, I ask that you reach out to me in advance, let me know what is going on, and then we can always talk about an extension to help avoid that 10% penalty. All assignments are delivered electronically, so everything is going to be going in through our Canvas site. There are, I have links for each of the pre-instructional, post-instructional assignments and the final assessment where you can submit those. And then your Canvas essays will then be posted directly into the discussion area in our Canvas site. So everything is being done electronically. Policy on withdrawals, this is an important one because if for some reason you determine that you cannot continue with the class, either you don't like me or something has happened, you can't continue, you do need to go through the withdrawal period. And the withdrawal period is a very short period here in the summer because we're only a 6-week course. If you don't go through the withdrawal process and we get to the end of our 6 weeks and I don't have a basis on which to grade you, then university policy requires that I issue a WU grade that stands for an unauthorized withdrawal. Why it's WU and not UW, I do not know, but it's an unauthorized withdrawal. That counts as an F for grade point average calculation purposes. So we want to try and keep WUs off of your transcript. WUs, once they get on a transcript, are next to impossible to get off of a transcript. So moral of the story here is if for some reason you can't finish out the class, go through the withdrawal process. There is a policy on incompletes as well. So if life does intervene and you're not able to complete the assignments in the class, there is the possibility for an incomplete. University policy requires that students have to complete at least 2/3 of the coursework before they can qualify for an incomplete. If you've completed 2/3 of the work and for some reason you're not able to complete the remainder, medical or whatever the case may be, let me know and we can discuss an incomplete. Incompletes are good for 1 year, 1 calendar year after they are issued. The problem though is a lot of people, when they take incompletes, they forget about the incompletes. And then if you don't finish up the incomplete, then the grade reverts to whatever grade is on the incomplete form. And so you would only be getting credit for 2/3 of the work in the course. If you have any documented disabilities, those need to be registered with, now it's called BMAC. I need to update that on the syllabus. The Bob Murphy Accessibility Center, I believe it's called BMAC. Register with BMAC. They will then reach out to me for reasonable accommodations. Attendance policy for our Tuesday evening sessions, I leave it completely up to you. I do recommend that you are here because we do cover information that's certainly not covered in the Mike Cell book. And I cover information differently than John did in his textbook. So it's important for you to be here. I don't take attendance, and so there are no penalties, no point deductions for you not being in a session, but it does behoove you to be here whenever possible. All sessions are recorded, as I said before, and provided on our Canvas site. You've met the technology requirements because you are in our Zoom session, so we don't need to go through that. Any changes to the syllabus will be very minor and they will always benefit you. So I'll never move any due dates up on you. That's not going to happen. I probably won't be moving any due dates back either because we only have 6 weeks. And so there's not a whole lot in terms of assignments. So the assignment dates will pretty much remain exactly what they are in the syllabus. Then all the rest of the required syllabus statements are required by academic senate policies. So I won't bore you with those. You can go through and read through those on your own. So that is the syllabus. Any questions about the syllabus or the basic requirements of the class? If not, let me stop this share. And let me share out with you the 2 documents that you're going to be using in part 2 of your post-instructional assignment. Give me 1 second here. And let me share out first the exercise you're going to use for part 2 in creating your consolidated budgets. Okay, you should be able to see a memo to AC Andrews, Deputy Budget Director. Are you seeing that on your screen now? Yes? Okay, excellent, very good. I'm using 2 screens here, and so I'm still getting used to the 2 screens. So, okay, here we go. So this is what's called Form 56. This is the form that you are going to be using with all of the parameters you must adhere to in creating your consolidated library budget. So here is the scenario. So you get this memo from the budget director and you are essentially the deputy budget director. So you are AC Andrews. As you know, the supervisors voted last night to approve the consolidation plan for the county library system. I would like you to take charge of putting together a preliminary first-year budget for the board's review. Your budget should take the following points into consideration. So we are consolidating the existing countywide budget into this consolidated budget. So in consolidating the budget, you have to abide by these 6 parameters in this Form 56. Number 1 parameter you have to abide by: all existing public libraries in the county, including the branches in the city of Waynesfield, are to remain open. I'll show you the spreadsheet in just a second, which lists all the different branches in the countywide library system. Waynesfield is the largest branch, and you'll see when you look at the spreadsheet, that's where most of your spending happens, is in the Waynesfield branch. But in consolidating the budget together, you have to make sure that all of the existing branches remain open. You cannot close a branch. Point number 2, the county's cost sharing agreement with municipalities assumes that there will be an overall savings of 3% from the aggregate of the existing library budgets. So you'll have to cut 3% from what is currently being spent by these library branches. You have to cut the overall budget by 3%. Doesn't sound like that big of a percentage, doesn't sound all that difficult, but it gets tougher. Number 3, no cuts are to be made in any full-time library employees. Cuts may be proposed in other categories. So you may not cut any full-time employees, no riffing of full-time employees, no reduction in the hours of full-time employees, no cuts in their salaries, no cuts whatsoever to full-timers. Part-timers are fair game. So if you want to lay off part-timers, you can. If you want to cut the hours of part-timers, you can do that as well. If you want to cut the amount of money you're spending on acquisitions of material, you can do that. If you want to cut maintenance, you can do that. So everything else is fair game other than full-time employees. Number 4, and this is the tough one. This is what makes this a little bit more difficult. As per the county's agreement with public employee unions, salary scales within job classifications are to be standardized at the highest levels currently paid by any of the newly consolidated units. And what does that mean? That means we have to standardize salaries. And when we look at the budget spreadsheet, you will see that there are positions such as a reference librarian, a branch librarian. For each one of those position classifications, there needs to be a standard salary where everybody in the reference librarian position gets paid the same, regardless of what branch they work in. Every branch librarian gets paid the same, regardless of what branch they work in. The trick, though, is that when you standardize the salaries, you have to standardize salaries up to the highest amount currently paid for that position. Now, the easy rule of thumb here is that for almost all the positions, Waynesfield, as the largest branch, is paying the highest amount. So you're usually, for almost all your positions, you're going to be standardizing salaries up to what Waynesfield is currently paying for that position classification. Now, I say for almost all, because there is, I believe, 1 or 2 exceptions where there are other branches that are paying more than Waynesfield. I'll let you find those exceptions on your own, but for the vast majority of the positions, you're going to be standardizing salaries up to the level currently paid by Waynesfield. That's what makes it difficult, because in essence, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be giving a whole lot of people pay raises and standardizing their salaries to what Waynesfield's currently paying. But at the same time, you have to cut 3% from the overall budget. So you're giving people wage increases, but you're also then going to be cutting the budget. So that's what makes this somewhat tricky. And you're going to have to play around with some different scenarios in putting your budget together. Then point number 5, all township and village librarians previously designated head librarians, whether full or part-time, are to be redesignated branch librarians and compensated accordingly. So what you have is you have a head librarian at a lot of these different branches. We're getting rid of the head librarian designation, so there will no longer be head librarians. All head librarians, with the exception of the one at Waynesfield, will now become branch librarians and will then get paid the standard salary for a branch librarian. So make sure that in your final budget, when you turn it in, you no longer have a designation for a head librarian, because there are no longer any head librarians. They have all become branch librarians, with the exception of, in number 6, the head librarian in the city of Waynesfield. The head librarian position in the city of Waynesfield will be eliminated. a new position called Director of County Libraries will be created and budgeted at $45,000. So you'll now have a new position called Director of County Libraries. So the Director of County Libraries is the old head librarian in the city of Waynesfield. Then all the other head librarians across the entire county will then become branch librarians. One thing you will find in this case study, I'm just going to tell you up front about it, is that when you are redesignating these head librarians into branch librarians, there are some part-time head librarians who are going to become part-time branch librarians. There is not currently a position classification for a part-time branch librarian. This is something you're going to be creating. So the question then becomes, what do I compensate someone at as a part-time branch librarian? To just make it simple, I would say make the part-time branch librarian salary half of what you're paying a full-time branch librarian. So I believe full-time branch librarians are paid $34,000. So just pay your part-time branch librarian half of that, $17,000. I think that's just a nice little shortcut to make it a little bit easier for you. But as you are putting your budget together, you must abide by these 6 different parameters. So you got to cut 3% from the budget, but you can't lay off any full-time employees. You can't close any branch libraries. You have to standardize salaries to the highest level currently paid in any position classification. You have to get rid of head librarians, replace them with branch librarians, and then you have to get rid of the head librarian in city of Waynesfield and replace that with a director of county libraries. So as you put your budget together, keep in mind those 6 different parameters. That document I provided for you in Canvas, so you can keep this next to you as you're putting your budget together. And then the way in which you put your budget together is you will be using the budget template that I've provided for you, which is, I'll share it out with you in a second, so as it decides to share. Okay, there you go. You should see the spreadsheet. This spreadsheet is a template that you will then be using to put your consolidated budget together. Let me go ahead and get rid of my camera there. Okay. So this is your spreadsheet you'll be working from. I know people come into the class with different experiences with Excel. I know some people are very well versed in Excel and you use it on a daily basis in your job. For others, you haven't used Excel much before. And so I'm providing you with this template that you can then use to create your budget. So in this template, all the formulas are already in there. And so all you need to do then is change your numbers and change your headings. So you'll see what you have is you have the city of Waynesfield. This is your largest branch here in column B. And you see all the positions that are currently employed in the city of Waynesfield branch. You have this head librarian at $40,000. Again, this person is going to become a director of county libraries. And so you replace head librarian with a director of county libraries. And instead of $40,000, it becomes $45,000. You have branch librarians. You can see you have 6 of those here in the city of Waynesfield. They are being paid $34,000 each. That is currently the highest amount that's currently being paid to any other branch librarian in any of the other branches. So all your other branch librarians, as you go across your spreadsheet, you'll see you've got some others. So all these other branch librarians here that are making less, they then have to get standardized up to the amount that's being paid by the city of Waynesfield. So you also have to remember that your head librarians too, across all of your other branches, all these head librarians are going to become branch librarians as well. So this person, this head librarian in Clear Creek, who's making $25,000 a year, is now going to become a branch librarian and will then be paid $34,000 a year. The one in Wolford, getting paid $27,500, will become a branch librarian. They will then get paid $34,000. So you can see how very quickly it escalates. And a lot of these folks are ending up getting some pretty sizable increases in their salaries because of the parameter number 4 in our guidance from the Huddleston file. So you can go through here for each one of your branches and you can make your changes in terms of changing your head librarians to branch librarians. You can then also see you have some part-time head librarians and some other branches that will become part-time branch librarians. You see you have other full-time staff such as administrative assistants, circulation clerks, maintenance workers, pages. You have part-time employees. Part-time employees are represented in terms of hourly wages. So if you're full-timers, that's their annual salary. For your part-time employees, that's their hourly wage. So hourly wage here in column B, column C, the total number of hours that circulation clerks work, for a grand total there of 42,120. But you can see the formulas are already there, so you just change your numbers, and the numbers in D will then automatically change. Then you also have other operating expenses such as acquisitions. You have to get materials into the library branches, books, media, things like that. That's your acquisitions amount, supplies, utilities, and maintenance, and some of your other operating expenses. So you're going to be using this spreadsheet then to create your consolidated spreadsheet. Now, my recommendation is obviously, since you have to cut 3% from the amount that's currently being spent, your first step here is to sum up, add up all the amounts that are currently being spent in this pre-consolidated budget. So do an auto sum, add them all up, and then take 3% off of that figure. That then becomes your new budget target. Once you've got that new budget target, you can then go back and start making the changes that are required from the parameters we talked about in the Huddleston file. So you're going to be producing this spreadsheet and turning this spreadsheet in, this consolidated spreadsheet, abiding by all the parameters in the Huddleston file. But then you're also going to be providing me with justifications for the cuts that you make. So in order to get your spending down 3%, you're going to have to make some cuts. So I want you to give me a justification for those cuts. How you provide those justifications really is up to you in terms of your working familiarity with Excel. If you know Excel well, then you know that you can add comments into your cells. And so if you want to just add your justifications as comments on your cells, all into a spreadsheet, that's absolutely fine. If you're not that comfortable with Excel, you want to give me a separate Word file just listing out your justifications for all your cuts, you can do that as well. But in part two, you're submitting your spreadsheet as well as the justifications for the cuts that you made in order to reduce the budget by 3%. These two documents, again, I have available for you in the Canvas site, and I'll show you where those are at in just a second. So you can just use those documents in order to produce part two of your post-instructional assignment. Any general questions about part two of the post-instructional? It's all clear as a muddy river right now. It'll become clearer as you work on it. And as you work on this, it'll all start to fall in place. A lot of it is trial and error. Determining how to get 3% cut from your budget. Just make sure that you make all your cuts, all your changes in compliance with those 6 requirements that we talked about in that Huddleston file. Let me show you now if I'm still logged in. I don't know if I am. I know we're going to take a break in just a minute. I know we're kind of running a little bit long, but I'm going to have to share my screen to do this, I think, because I think it has now disappeared. Okay, let me go ahead and just share out my screen, and let me go and take you to, let me get this open. Hold on one second. Okay. Okay, so let me do this. There's all that. Okay. All right, let me clean some stuff up here. Okay. Let's go into our Canvas site, and let me go ahead and put the Canvas site into student view. Okay. Hopefully you're able to see the Canvas site. Can you see our Canvas site there? Everybody see it? Yes? Okay. All right. So this is Canvas site. I hope you've been able to take a look at it. It's been published for a little while. I'd like to publish my Canvas sites early so you have time to poke around and kind of see what the class is all about and what's available for you. But let me go to the home. So here we go. Again, the link I provided in our welcome message. So you all have that since you're all in the session. Syllabus, obviously under the syllabus link, it's there for you. Most of the information you're going to need then will be under the modules. And so I have the syllabus again, then the pre-instructional, those 8 questions you're going to be answering on your budget for the pre-instructional, that file is there for you. Huddleston exercise, that's the Huddleston form with those 6 different parameters. That's available for you right there. And then the Excel spreadsheet that we're using is available at that link. So those are all provided for you right there for your reference. Week number 1, the PowerPoint slides we're going to use in the second half of class 9 are there for you. And then here is your link to participate in the introductory posting. Then in week number 2, I've got for you right there our additional supplemental information, a website on the federal budget process, a website on the California state budget process, our PowerPoint slides, and then I have some examples of different budget formats for you, performance budgets, program budgets, zero-based budgets, and we'll go through those examples next week as we talk about budget formats in the second half of class next week. And then to participate in the first graded Canvas essay, there's your link for that. You click on that and you'll see your first Canvas essay is to please review the governor's budget proposal and may revise at the following link. I provide the link for you. If you click on that link, it will then take you to the governor's proposed budget as well as the May revise, which just recently came out. And after reviewing quickly the governor's budget, especially the summary section, don't go through the entire budget because it's incredibly long, but the summary section of the governor's budget, the summary section for the May revision, identify 2 priorities in the governor's budget, and then tell me how those priorities have changed as a result of the May revise. The governor's budget is usually produced in January, and then in May, we have a revision. And that May revise will then revise our assumptions in terms of the amount of revenue we're going to be generating. And then we have to make changes to what we're able to spend based upon those changed revenue expectations. And so that's what's called the May revise. And so how have the priorities changed as a result of that May revise? But it gives you an opportunity to go and kind of poke around a little bit with the governor's budget, the May revise, and kind of familiarize yourself with some of the major areas of spending here in the state of California. So that's your first graded Canvas essay, and then you'll respond to 2 of your classmates as well. Then here's week number 3, our analysis and accounting PowerPoint slides. I have a little primer on here in terms of how to read an annual comprehensive financial report, and we'll go through that in class. Here is again the pre-instructional questions just for your reference. Then your Canvas essay number 2 is right here. In Canvas essay number 2, you will be considering the budget that you use for your pre-instructional assignment, discuss what budget format is used by the city. If you had to recommend a different budget format, what format would you recommend and why? And then 2 responses to classmates. Scroll down again. But also here in week 3, because you have your pre-instructional assignment due, this is the link to submit your pre-instructional assignment. So there's your pre-instructional assignment again. And then you'll just, if you haven't done it yet, you can just upload it, your pre-instructional assignment, hit submit, and it will submit it directly to the Dropbox. And let's move on to week number 4. In week number 4, we get into capital budgeting and debt management. You've got your PowerPoint slides there. I then have an actual example of a bond that was passed when I was on a school board several years ago. So you can kind of see what an actual bond looks like and what bond language looks like. And then Canvas essay number 3, we won't go through all 5 of them, but here's Canvas essay number 3, looking at the annual comprehensive financial report for your city. So in addition to your budget here in this week, you're going to get the annual comprehensive financial report, which will be provided as well on the city website. Look at the comprehensive annual financial report. According to the information reviewed, how fiscally solvent is your city? What information did you use to arrive at that conclusion? Does your fiscal solvency conclusion differ between your review of the budget and the annual financial report? If you want to get a good, clear, holistic picture of the finances of a city, you look at their budget and you look at their annual comprehensive financial report. The budget is a prospective document that will tell you how the city plans on spending its money in the upcoming fiscal year. The annual comprehensive financial report is a retrospective document. It will tell you how the city actually did spend its money in the previous fiscal year. So you get the prospective and the retrospective by combining the budget with the annual comprehensive financial report. Then week number 5, we're going to do taxation. You've got your taxation slides there. You have a site for California graduated income tax brackets, federal graduated income tax brackets. A document here explaining the split roll, and we'll talk about that when we get to that week. And then Canvas essay number 4 and your responses. And then finally, our last week, week number 6, intergovernmental fiscal relations slides. Your post-instructional assignment available for you there as well. Then the Huddleston documents there again. The budget template is there again for you as well. So I just want to make sure you have these documents in multiple places. And here is a submission link for your post-instructional assignment, and then Canvas essay number 5 and 2 responses. All of our sessions are being recorded, and so by the next day, I will then post a link to the recording for the previous night right here under our Zoom recordings link. And then at the very bottom here, if you don't have a lot of experience with Excel, Dr. Moore, a couple of years ago, put together a series of videos showing you how to use Excel for different types of purposes. So if you don't know Excel very well, if you click on that tutorial, it'll first give you an error, but don't worry about that. Just click on Excel tutorial again. It'll then take you to a SharePoint that has several different movies, several different videos on here showing you Excel. So here are the basics of Excel, and then examples of how to do the basics, graphical displays in Excel, basic quantitative analysis, statistical analysis, financial analysis, and I believe there's one more, and then a what if analysis. And so different videos that he has put together to help you understand all the different features of Excel. If you're not familiar with Excel, feel free to use that tutorial, and I think it'd be very useful for you. If you are conversant with Excel and you know Excel well, then you don't need to use that tutorial. But again, different people coming into class with different experiences with Excel. So that is our Canvas site. Again, I think it's all pretty straightforward. I've got all the documentation that you need in there to help you succeed in the class. So we've covered the course, we've covered the syllabus, we've covered the documents that you need in order to put together your post-instructional assignment, and we've taken a little mini tour of our Canvas site to show you what documents are there and what types of resources are there to help you be successful in the course. So, questions on any of this course-related material up to this point in time? Okay, all good? Then I don't know about you, but I'm ready for a break. It's about 7:30, so let's go ahead and take a break. I usually like to do about a 15-minute break. So let's say come on back at 7:45, and when you come back at 7:45, we will jump into some of our introduction to public finance information. I think I'll probably be able to get through all that in about an hour without a problem. So we'll cover that information, and then we'll call it quits for the night. So take a break till 7:45, come back, and we'll do introduction to public finance. Okay, we are back, and it's 7:45. So let's go ahead and get into our information on public finance and kind of just create that foundation for everyone, regardless of the background you have in budgeting, so that we can all kind of start on the same foot. So when we talk about budgets, what is a budget? It's always the basic question, and how do we define a budget? And I think we all have a pretty good working idea of what a budget is. A budget is as I said before the break, a prospective statement of planned expenditures. So with a budget, we are saying this is how the city is planning on spending its money, how much is planning on spending, and what is planning on spending its money on. So what's being spent, money's being spent on, how much money is being spent, By whom? So who's doing the spending, which agencies or which departments or units are doing the spending, and then for whom? Who are the beneficiaries of that spending? But at the very basic level, it is this prospective statement of expenditures. But I would argue that a budget actually means more than just that. That a budget is also a statement of societal values and priorities. We're always dealing with infinite demands and finite resources. When infinite demands come into conflict with finite resources, we are going to have to make decisions. We're going to have to prioritize spending on one program versus another program. It is very much what we consider in game theory a zero-sum game. That when you have finite resources, one program will get funded at the detriment of another program. So when we are funding more on education than we are funding on defense, that's going to be a statement of what that society prioritizes. If we're spending more money on foreign aid and less money on children's health programs, that's a statement on the priorities of that society. That's an important distinction, because once we start talking about a budget as being a statement of priorities, we are really elevating its importance in terms of being more than just a budget document. Now it really provides us with good insight into what we value as a society. In the world of organization theory literature, there is a school of thought known as organization culture. And organization culture says that we can study organizations by learning about their cultures. We can study their cultures by looking at the artifacts that are created, such as agendas and minutes from meetings and things such as that. Well, this is similar here. We can study the culture of a society by looking at its budget, because that budget is an artifact of the culture that will show us what that society values and what the society does not value at any given point in time. So I really would recommend to you think about a budget as being this statement of priorities more so than just a statement of dollars and cents. So as we know in this country, we tend to favor the private sector in that we have the invisible hand of the markets, in that we tend to say, well, if possible, we should leave it to the private sector. So the question then becomes, well, why do we have public expenditures if we tend to be a free market type of economy? We have public expenditures and therefore public budgets because primarily of market failures. And you've talked about this in your 518 course or in your Econ 101 course. You've talked about market failures. So you're probably familiar with what a market failure is. A market failure is not a pejorative term. It's not a negative term against the private sector. With a market failure, the market fails to produce and or provide a good or service that is deemed necessary by the majority of society. Whenever the market fails to produce it, it can fail to produce it for a variety of reasons. The market could just choose not to produce and provide a good or service. And they would choose not to produce a good or service because obviously there's no bottom line. There's no profit motivation. So if there's no profit motivation, the private sector won't do it. And so therefore it's left for the public sector. Sometimes in terms of logistics, it's just logistically impossible for the private sector to provide and or produce a good or a service. So think about something like everyday mail delivery. Everyday mail delivery, the obstacles to getting involved in the provision and production of everyday mail delivery, those obstacles are just too steep for a lot of private sector companies to bear. So obviously we have FedEx and UPS and all these package delivery services, but when it comes to daily mail delivery service, that is just too logistically difficult, too expensive for the private sector to get involved in, and so therefore it is left to the public sector. Not to mention that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution provides Congress with the ability to establish post offices. And so there's also a constitutional basis for the U.S. Postal Service, which is a government corporation. We'll talk more about that in a future class. So number one reason why we have public expenditures and therefore public budgets, market failures. The second reason is the problem of externalities. And you're all probably very familiar with what an externality is. What is an externality? Someone tell me what's an externality. That's kind of in the name itself, an externality. So it's outside.
An unintended consequence?
Exactly. Yeah, it's an unintended consequence. It's something that we didn't go out there to try and create, but it's something that is created as a result of doing something else. And so, an externality can be something such as pollution. And we have, as our economists would say, we have our widget factory. And we have this great widget factory that's located on top of this hill. And this widget factory does a great job of producing high quality widgets. But in the process of producing those widgets, they also then end up polluting the river that runs behind the factory. That is a negative externality. They didn't set out to cause pollution. They set out to create a good product, but the pollution is an unintended consequence. So pollution is your classic example of a negative externality. Negative externalities like pollution recommend to us a role for government involvement. That for that widget factory, there is no market-based incentive for them to clean up that pollution. It's not going to increase their profit margin. In fact, it's going to decrease their profit margin. So absent altruistic incentives, there's really no reason for them in a market-based approach to go out there and clean up that pollution. So someone then has to clean up that pollution. Someone has to hold the company accountable for the pollution that they've created and try and regulate future pollution. So that suggests a role for government. When government gets involved in the regulation of some aspect of the economy, obviously it's going to call for government expenditures. You're going to have to create an agency. You're going to have to hire people. You're going to have to pay those individuals. You have to provide them with the resources they need to monitor pollution. You have to purchase the monitoring devices that you're going to use. There are a lot of expenditures that will accrue because of that government intervention. But not all externalities, not all unintended consequences are bad. Some are good. There can be positive externalities as well. So an example of a positive externality could be if you have a childhood immunization program that is provided to families below a certain income eligibility guideline. The primary beneficiary of the immunization program will be the children in those eligible families. But the benefits will accrue to those outside of that family as well, in terms of if you reduce the amount of illness in a jurisdiction, then there's less chance that other people are going to get sick, which means you're not going to have the negative impacts on productivity of people missing work. There are positive externalities that will accrue to people who are secondary and tertiary beneficiaries of that program. Those are considered to be positive types of externalities. Positive externalities suggest a role for government intervention and expenditure as well. And the reason for that is that when a good produces a positive externality, that good tends to be underproduced. But when it produces a negative externality, the good tends to be overproduced. The negative one is easy to see. So if it produces a negative externality, that corporation is not going to take into account the cost of cleaning up that externality. So they're going to produce more and more of that good, and producing more of that good will then produce more pollution, more of that negative externality. So negative externalities, those goods tend to be overproduced. However, with a positive externality, those tend to be underproduced because those secondary and those tertiary beneficiaries who are benefiting from lower levels of illness in their communities, their desire for this program will not be taken into account in considering the supply. The supply will be dictated by the number of income eligible families, the primary beneficiaries. We don't take the secondary and tertiary beneficiaries into account in determining how much of that good to produce. So therefore, we tend to underproduce those goods that produce positive externalities. So that then suggests a role for us, perhaps in terms of government subsidization, and that governments will get involved in subsidizing the production of these goods in order to increase the level of production and therefore increase the amount of positive externalities. So externalities, whether they are positive or negative, do suggest important roles for government intervention. And the more government intervention you have in the economy, the more public expenditures you have. The more public expenditures you have, the larger your public sector budgets will become. So that kind of gives us a rationale, a basic rationale for why we have public budgets to begin with. But why not just study public budgets the way we study private budgets? Why do we have to have a separate PPA 555 course rather than just leave it to the College of Business to do? And there's some important reasons why public budgets differ from private sector budgets. And a lot of these things we're very familiar with. One has to do with the environment, that we have a larger number and variety of actors in public budgeting than what we typically see at the private sector level. In public budgeting, we have a lot more beneficiaries, we have a lot more stakeholders, and those stakeholders tend to be much more active. The money we are spending is public taxpayer money, so people have much more of a vested interest in how the government is spending money. It gets back to the whole idea that you probably talked about in your 500 class, looking at the environment of the public versus the private sector. Public sector environments tend to be larger, they tend to be more complex, and they have greater heterogeneity of the actors in those environments as compared to the private sector. It's what John Gauss refers to as the ecology of public administration. To understand public administration and what goes on in public organizations, including budgeting, we have to understand the environment in which those organizations operate. As we said already, citizen money means accountability. We are using public taxpayer money. And when we're using public taxpayer money, we have to be held accountable for how we are spending that money. That's why in a state like here in California, we have a lot of transparency requirements. We have the Brown Act that requires public meetings and really limits the types of issues that can be dealt with by a governing body outside of a public meeting. It's that idea of a sunshine law. We have a Public Records Request Act, Public Records Act, where members of the public can put in public requests, get the emails, and they get the conversations and the dialogue between members of a governing body to really see what those deliberations look like. And so we've got a lot of these accountability measures, much more so in the public as compared to the private sector. Well, in all of my classes, I always like to ask the question, well, so what? So we have these enhanced accountability measures in the public sector. Great, well, so what? Well, what does that mean for budgeting? What that means for budgeting is that in public budgeting is oftentimes a much slower process. It's a much more protracted process. If you engage in any type of purchasing in the public sector, you know all the steps you need to go through in making those purchases. If you engage in any type of construction in the public sector, you know all the steps you have to go through. You have to put together a request for proposals, an RFP. You have to then send that RFP out and advertise that RFP. You then have to solicit competitive bids, which are sealed bids. You then have to advertise when those bids are being opened. And you then have to do that publicly. You then have to publicly declare which bid is being accepted as the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. You've got all these requirements you have to go through in competitive bidding because we are spending taxpayer money. It's a much more detailed, much more complex and protracted process than what we see in the private sector. I always use the example when I would teach 500, looking at differences between public and private sectors. I always use the example of the renovations of the ice rink in Central Park in New York City. And Central Park had an ice rink back in the 1970s and 1980s that had fallen into disrepair. And the city wanted to repair that ice rink. The problem was it was taking the city a very long time to do so, and they were always coming in past their budgeted end date and always coming in over budget. And the problem was that they had to do competitive bidding, and they had to not only bid out to the the contractors, but the subcontractors and the subcontractors and the contractors had to be bonded. They had to be licensed with the state. It took a long time. And so the city then turned to somebody you probably heard of. His name's Donald Trump. At that time, he wasn't president. He was a businessman in New York City. And Trump said, well, I'll take over the renovations of the ice rink and we'll get it done a lot quicker. And sure enough, it was done a lot quicker, it was done a lot cheaper. And the reason for that is because he didn't have to do the competitive bidding. He took over the construction himself and he could hire contractors, any contractors that he wanted to hire. Tell contractors, you need to get this project done by this certain date. They knew if they didn't get it done by that date, they wouldn't get a future job with Trump's company. And so therefore they got the job done. Just illustrates some of the differences between doing it in the public sector versus doing it in the private sector. But again, all these regulations, all these transparency requirements are there because of the nature of the money that is being spent. The planning in budgeting is different in the public versus the private sector. We tend to plan our expenditures much more in advance in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Our capital improvement plans are going to be at a minimum 5-year capital improvement plans. And oftentimes, if we issue a bond, we are going to put together a master plan for all the projects we're going to fund with that bond money. And that master plan could be 10, 15, 20, 30 years in duration. We tend to plan very far in advance. We obviously have more limitations and more constraints in what we do in the public as compared to the private sector. We are limited in terms of our appropriations. The appropriations we receive, they're appropriated for a certain type of expenditure. They need to be spent on that certain type of expenditure. We can't just go out and spend the money however we see fit. We use fund-based accounting, as we'll talk about later on this semester in the public sector. We segregate our funds, money into different funds, and we oftentimes cannot cross over from one fund to the other, again, for the purpose of control. We have a lot of these limitations. We have political limitations. We have political oversight, a lot more than what we see in the private sector. Much in line with that, the amount of scrutiny not only comes from taxpayers, it comes from our congressional overseers, it comes from the executive branch, and more today it comes from the judiciary as well. And the judiciary and the issuance of what we call structural remedies, where the judiciary will actually come in and tell administrators, this is an action you must take, and here are the punitive measures for not taking the action that we're telling you to take. So a lot more scrutiny in the public sector. Because of all these differences, it's important that we have a different way in which we study public budgeting as opposed to the way in which the College of Business would study the budget of a private corporation. Another big difference between studying public budgeting and private budgeting is in terms of the types of goods that we are funding in our budgets. Most of the goods that we fund in our budgets are what we consider to be public goods. Most of the goods that are funded in a private sector budget are private goods. So what's the primary difference between a public and a private good? The difference between public and private good really run along the lines of two characteristics: exhaustibility and excludability. So we look at a good and we ask the question, is this good exhaustible and is this good excludable? Is it exhaustible, meaning that are people rivals for this good? That one person using this good means that it's consumed and then is not available for someone else to use. The more exhaustibility there is with the good, the more likely it is a private type of good. Excludability, can we exclude people who do not pay for that good? So if people do not pay for the benefits they're getting from a good, are we able to exclude them and say, well, you didn't pay for it, so you do not get these benefits? The more excludable a good, the more likely it is to fall along the private side of that spectrum of private to public goods. So with public goods, we cannot exhaust and we cannot exclude. So you think about something like national defense. Me getting a benefit from national defense does not erode the benefit that you also can get from national defense. It's not a zero-sum game. Our benefits are not mutually exclusive. It's also difficult to exclude people from partaking in the benefits of national defense. You can't say, well, you pay so much in taxation, so therefore you get more national defense protection than someone who pays less in taxation. So that's why national defense tends to be the example of a pure public good. Contrast that to a pure private good in which you can exhaust and you can exclude. So something such as a Three Musketeers bar that's on a store shelf is a pure private good. It can be exhaustive. There's only one on the shelf. Two people go in. Whoever is fastest gets to the shelf first and gets to consume that candy bar. Once the candy bar is eaten, it is then gone and not available for anyone else. And it's excludable that if you don't have the money to pay for that Three Musketeers bar, you do not get that Three Musketeers bar. So those are your opposite ends of the spectrum. But it's not that easy, in that there's a gray area in between pure public and pure private goods. And within that gray area, we have two other types of goods. We have what are called toll goods and what are called common pool goods. With a toll good, we cannot exhaust it. We cannot use it up, but we can exclude people who do not pay for it. So obviously the perfect example of that would be a toll road. You pull up to the toll road booth and you pay your money, the bar goes up and you then drive on the toll road. If you don't pay your money, the bar stays down, you cannot drive on the toll road. So you can exclude people. But it's not exhaustible in that everyone who pays to drive on that road eventually, absent congestion, will be able to drive on that road. Then there are what we call common pool goods, which are the opposite of a toll good. In a common pool good, you can exhaust, you can use it up, but it's difficult to exclude people. So there are fewer examples of common pool goods, but an example of a common pool good could be natural resource rights and mineral pool rights, in that you can use them up, that once you use up those natural resources, they're gone for future generations, but it's difficult to exclude people and to say, well, you get access and you do not get access. So when you think about public and private goods, you want to think about this in terms of being on a spectrum. Public and private goods at the polar opposites, and then the gray area in between, you have toll and common pool goods. Well, so what? Well, the big so what of that is that we have different types of goods and services that we are funding in our public budgets as compared to what we would fund in a private budget. Pure public goods tend to be funded in a public budget. Pure private goods tend to be left to the free market. Toll and common pool goods, it depends. And it depends upon how we interpret those goods and the proper role of government in the provision and or production of those goods. One way in which we can limit the size of our budgets is by limiting the amount of goods that we consider to be pure public goods. The more you consider a good to be private, the more likely you are to then engage in privatization and to turn the production and provision of that good over to the private sector. Now, obviously, we saw a lot of privatization, especially in the 1970s and the 1980s. That wave of privatization meant that we essentially privatized everything that was easy to privatize. So if it's easy to privatize, we've already privatized it. Things like trash collection, very easy to privatize. It's exhaustible, it's excludable. We could easily privatize that, and we have easily privatized that. Where we are now currently in privatization is trying to privatize goods that are not as clearly private in nature. And so things such as prisons, things such as education, they have some private elements, they have some public elements. And so we struggle all the time about whether or not to privatize. When we privatize, we oftentimes do it with the argument that if we privatize it, turn it over to the private sector, we will enhance competition. By enhancing competition, we will then be able to reduce prices. We'll have more efficiency. The negative side of privatization is obviously a loss of control. That when we privatize it, as a government, we lose control over how it's being provided and produced. And we have a lot of loss of quality control. We have loss in terms of our ability to make sure that people with less resources are able to get access to the staples of life. And so there are advantages and disadvantages, but for the most part, we have privatized everything that was easy to privatize. But privatization is one way in which we can limit the amount of public expenditures and therefore limit the size of our public budgets. One thing you have probably noticed so far over the past half hour or so is I keep saying provision and or production. And I do that for a reason that's very intentional, because provision and production are different things. They're related, but they are different. Provision speaks to giving the resources to make the production possible. Production is the actual creation of that good or that service. So provision is giving the resources to make production possible. Production is the actual creation of the good or the service. So if you think about what we are doing here tonight in this budgeting course, this is the production. This is where we're actually covering the material. This is the production of the education and public budgeting. The provision would be the resources that are provided in order to make this class session possible. So the license that the university pays for with Zoom, that's providing the resources to make this possible. The tuition that you're paying, I know the tuition is higher in the summer because it's run by CPACE as compared to being run by the state side of the operation. The tuition that you pay, the fees you pay in the summer, that's part of the provision that make this course possible. So once we realize there's a difference between provision and production, we also then realize that privatization is not a monolithic term. That's not either privatize or don't privatize. So there are many gradations of privatization. So in one situation, we can have government doing both provision as well as production. That would be a pure public good that is left to the creation, the provision, and the production by government entities. That's a typical pure public good we see in a public budget. We can have a situation where the government provides the resources and then the private sector does the production. This is your classic example of contracting out. This is your classic example of how we usually privatize in this country. So we'll contract out with a private corporation. We will then use government resources to pay this corporation. So that's the provision. The corporation then actually produces the good or the service. And whenever we are constructing a building in the public sector, this is the type of privatization we do. We hire contractors. The specialty is to actually construct buildings, and they do the actual construction. So that's your typical privatization. The reverse of that is private provision and government production. Now, this is a much rarer type of situation. We don't have a lot of great examples. I think John Mikesell in his book uses the example of a concert promoter. So if you have a concert promoter the concert promoter wants to have security at the venue for their concert. So they will then hire a local police department to come in and to actually produce the security services at the venue. They pay the police department. It would be private sector provision, government sector production. But again, that's a relatively rare type of manifestation. And at the extreme end, you have all private provision and production. This would be a pure private good that is left to a private corporation to provide as well as to produce. But this distinction between provision and production is a very important distinction because it shows us that privatization is just not a binary consideration and that there are many gradations to ways in which we can come up with arrangements that use both the public and the private sector in providing and producing these goods and these services. So the more things that we consider to have private components, the less we have public expenditures and the smaller our public budgets will become. The more things we consider public, the larger our public budgets. The question though for us is that a public budget is a societal level document. That public budget, as we said on our very first slide, is a statement of societal priorities. So it's a societal, a macro level type of document. How do we get from individual preferences for policies and programs to a societal level public budget? There must be some type of a mechanism, some decision-making calculus to get from an individual citizen's preferences to the programs and policies incorporated within a societal public budget. But one thing we know in translating individual decisions into public decisions is that it's not a summative process. It's not a process whereby we can just add up all the wants, needs, and desires of our individual citizens And the summative total will then give us our public budget. It doesn't work that way. I mean, wants, needs, and desires of one person are going to cancel out the wants, needs, and desires of another. So we need to have some type of a choice model that will allow us to translate individual decisions into public decisions. And we've got two options here. The classic option is what's called the Pareto optimal model. And you've probably run into a Pareto optimal choice model before in the program. But in a Pareto optimal model, we will make a decision if that decision benefits at least one person without harming anyone else. So we're going to use a Pareto optimal model for putting our public budgets together. We will choose programs that benefit at least one person, but do not harm anybody else. So they benefit one person, but no one gets harmed. That would be the type of program that would then be selected to be included in our public budgets. The problem with that is that the vast majority of our programs and policies in this country tend to be redistributive in nature. And if you've had the policy class, you know that there are different types of policies. There are what we call distributive policies, redistributive policies, and regulatory policies. In a distributive policy, it's very much the Pareto optimal approach, that the policy will benefit some people, but nobody gets harmed. So some people benefit, but nobody gets harmed by that policy. There are very few examples of purely distributive policies in our policymaking. The vast majority of our policies tend to either be redistributive policies or regulatory policies. A redistributive or regulatory policy is not going to fit the criterion of a Pareto optimal model. So therefore, we need to have a more practical model that will explain what ends up getting included in our public budgets. And the more practical model is an economic model known as the Kaldor-Hicks model. The Kaldor-Hicks model is a variation on Pareto optimal. And the first part of the model is the same. We will select programs to fund that benefit at least one person, but they can harm other people as long as those who benefit compensate those who are harmed. So again, in a Kaldor-Hicks model, we'll select a program that benefits some people, but those people who benefit will then end up compensating those people who are initially harmed by this program. The Kaldor-Hicks model allows us to have a redistributive type of approach. The Kaldor-Hicks model explains why the majority of our public programs tend to be redistributive or regulatory. Some people benefit from them, but those who are harmed eventually, in theory at least, will get compensated. The classic example of a Kaldor-Hicks type of model in policymaking, especially economic policy, is the example of trickle-down economics. In the Reagan administration, the Reaganomics was really based upon trickle-down, that if we provide tax cuts to individuals and corporations at the upper part of our income tax structure, they get those tax breaks. They will then use that additional revenue to then create jobs. By creating jobs, then those jobs will then be provided for people in lower income levels who don't directly benefit from tax breaks, and that's how they get compensated. So even though you have a tax break for your upper income wage earners, eventually those people who are at the lower end will then benefit because the benefits will trickle down through the economy through the creation of jobs and corporations and organizations. That's the idea, at least the theory behind trickle-down economics, which fits very well with this Kaldor-Hicks type of a model. Kaldor-Hicks explains the vast majority of our public budgets, the programs in our public budgets, because it directly explains why we have these redistributive programs. We're going to redistribute wealth from one segment of society to another, but it's okay because those segments of society that are losing wealth, that are having their wealth redistributed, are going to benefit in some other way down the line. And so they will eventually benefit. So therefore, it makes it an acceptable type of program to incorporate within our public budgets. So I think the Kaldor-Hicks model is by far the more realistic way in which we determine what gets funded in our budgets versus what does not get funded. So who makes these decisions? So who's deciding what goes into our budget and what does not go into our budget? Who are the actors typically in the public budgeting process? And next week, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how the process works at the federal as well as the state and local level. But from a more generic type of perspective, who are these basic actors who are involved in public budgeting? Well, obviously, we have what Mike so calls our bureau chiefs. Bureau chiefs are the heads of our agencies and our departments and our commissions. These bureau chiefs tend to want to maximize their budget requests. And so every year at the federal level, agency heads are asked by the Office of Management and Budget to provide their budget requests for the next fiscal year. So as the head of an agency, you're going to want to acquire as many resources as possible for your agency. That will contribute to agency survival. So you're probably going to ask for more than you actually think you need next year. So you think you need 3%, you may ask for 5 or 6%. That's a strategy known as budget maximization. And so you will strategically misrepresent your needs to try and maximize your budget for the next fiscal year. So that's the vested interest of these bureau chiefs. But that budget maximization tendency on the part of our bureau chiefs is then countered by an executive budget office at the federal level. It's the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as the OMB. So the OMB will receive these maximized budget requests. They will then cut those requests. Those reduced requests then become part of the executive budget. So it's kind of like this balancing act we have between the heads of agencies and the Executive Budget Office, the Office of Management and Budget. The corollary to the Office of Management and Budget here in the state of California is the Department of Finance. So those are important players in the process. The chief executive is an important player in the process as well. At the federal level, as well as in the vast majority of our states, the budgeting process is a very executive-dominated process. At the federal level, the president puts their budget together in January, transmits it to Congress in early February, and then Congress has to work within the parameters of the budget that was created by the president, making it a very executive-driven process. Here in California, we also have an executive-driven process. The governor puts their budget together in January, transmits it to the state legislature, and then the state legislature has to operate within the parameters of that budget. So the chief executive is a very important player in the budgeting process. Legislative leaders are very important players in the process as well. And so you're at the federal level, your Speaker of the House, your minority leader in the House, your majority leader in the Senate, your minority leader in the Senate, your chairs of your House and your Senate budget committees, your chairs of your House and Senate appropriations committees, and there are 12 different subcommittees, your chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, your chair of the Finance Committee in the Senate. Those legislative leaders are also very important players in the budgeting process. Today, congressional committees are also very important in the budgeting process as well. Back in the 1970s, we created a House and a Senate Budget Committee. And the House and the Senate Budget Committee are the central starting points for the executive budget when it arrives in Congress. So they get first crack at making changes to the president's budget. So congressional committees are important today. We all know that interest groups also have an important role to play in budgeting. And as we talk about the federal budget process next week, we'll talk more about the pronounced role that interest groups have in putting together the federal budget. And the courts. Today, the judiciary has gotten very involved in budgeting as well. And so the judiciary will review actions of administrators and will then offer these structural remedies that will have profound impacts upon the budgets of state and local governments. So the courts have become very active actors as well in the budgeting process. Because of all of these actors in the process, and because of the very complex environment in which public budgets are created, a lot of people will bemoan the budgeting process as being political. So people say, well, it doesn't matter whether or not I participate in the process, doesn't matter whether or not I understand the process, because the public budgeting process is all political. And they usually use that political term in very much a pejorative manner, in that I don't have the efficacy to get involved because it's all political and it's all out of my hand. So typically when people talk about the politics of budgeting, they will be talking about a variety of different types of things. Sometimes when people bemoan the politics of budgeting, they're talking about the politics of reform. They're saying we need to reform the process. But reforming the process is political. Democrats will want to reform the process in a way in which will benefit their policy goals. Republicans want to reform the process to try and benefit their policy goals. We're not trying to get it done in a bipartisan way. It's all political. The parties are just trying to benefit themselves. The second way people talk about the politics of budgeting is when they bemoan the incremental nature of budgeting. Budgeting tends to be very incremental, in which we have very small changes from one year to the next. That's incremental decision making. We may see a 2% or a 3% or a 4% increase from one year to the next, but we oftentimes don't have whole-scale changes to the programs we're funding or how much we are spending on those programs. So when people say it's political, they mean it never really changes. It's all just the same old status quo. Sometimes when people complain about the politics of budgeting, they're talking about the domination of interest groups. It's the interest groups that have the resources and the membership that can directly lobby Congress. They're the ones who have the biggest influence on the budget. Therefore, it's all political. Sometimes when people talk about the politics of the process, they're talking about the process itself and how broken the process is. It is very rare today at the federal level for us to get our budgets done on time. Typically, we are unable to pass all 12 appropriation bills by the end of the fiscal year. And so therefore, we end up either with what we call continuing resolutions, an omnibus budget reconciliation act, or a government shutdown. And more recently, we have opted for that latter, the government shutdown. Here in the state of California, we tend to be better at getting our budget done on time, but we are better at it because of two reasons. One, we have a Democratic supermajority in the Assembly as well as the Senate and a Democratic governor. So whenever you have unified government, it makes it much easier to get your budget done on time. And secondly, we no longer need a supermajority in order to pass a budget. A simple majority will suffice, which has made it much easier for us to get the budget done on time here in California, which makes it look like the process is not quite as broken as the process at the federal level. But not only are we not getting the budget done on time at the federal level, but we are also not balancing the budget. Every single year, we have higher levels of expenditures than we have revenues. We are running a deficit every single year. And I don't know if it will surprise you or not, but all the way back to 1969, for every year since 1969 until this current year, we have run a budget deficit at the federal level with the exception of 2 years. 2 years where we're actually in surplus spending. So again, the process is broken. Sometimes when people talk about the politics of budgeting, they're talking about policy debates and the actual substantive debate between, are we going to fund this policy? Are we going to fund that policy? Are we going to fund this program? Or are we going to fund that program? The problem is that whenever people view the process as being political, whenever they view budgeting as political, they tend not to want to engage in the process. They feel like they have no agency in the process and there's nothing that they can do in order to affect the process. They become very disaffected with the process. They generate very negative views about budgeting and budget makers. And sometimes they're just willing to just wash their hands of the entire process. I think that's one of the reasons why sometimes we don't have a lot of students who do the government finance certificate. That's one of the reasons why there are a lot of budgeting and finance positions in the public sector that are going vacant because there aren't applicants to actually fill those positions. Again, I think it's a lot of discontent with the politics of the budgeting process. When we are putting budgets together, we are inherently making decisions. Again, it's a statement of societal priorities. So we are making decisions about what should be included in the budget, what should not be included in the budget, what should get a budget increase, what should get a budget decrease. So we're making decisions all the time in public budgeting. And public budgeting is all about decision making. Decision making in public budgeting can occur in a variety of different clusters. One decision-making cluster in public budgeting is the revenue cluster, where we have to decide how much revenue we're able to generate, and then we have to decide where that revenue should come from. What form of taxation should we use? And most importantly, what citizens or what groups should bear the primary burden for this taxation? Should we have taxation that affects primarily upper income individuals? Should we have a consumption-based tax that would affect everyone equally? Who pays the tax? Those are the types of decisions we make in this revenue decision-making cluster. A second decision-making cluster is a procedural one. We have to decide how we're going to put that budget together. So are we going to put that budget together in an executive-driven process? Are we going to use a more legislatively driven process like they do down in the state of Texas? What should the process be? And next week, we'll talk about some reforms to the federal budget process, and you'll see that a lot of those reforms were indeed procedural types of reforms in terms of actually changing the process of constructing the budget. The expenditure cluster, we make decisions about, again, how much money to spend and what to spend that money on. The balance cluster, we have to make decisions about how important it is for us to balance our revenues and our expenditures. Not all deficits and not all debt are bad. There are sometimes some good reasons why you would want to have a situation where your expenditures exceed your revenues. What's known as counter-cyclical spending. So if you're in poor financial times and you have high unemployment rates, what you may want to do is you may want to spend more money. You want to spend money on maybe public infrastructure programs to get people back to work. And you're spending more money while you're bringing in less money. You're going to run a deficit, but hopefully that counter-cyclical spending will then stimulate the economy in the future, and it will then help you then enhance your revenues in future years. So that type of counter-cyclical spending means that it's okay to run a deficit. Now, clearly, it's not okay if you're running deficits year after year after year because you do not have the political willpower to cut spending to bring it in line with the amount of money that you're raising. So running deficits every year since 1969, with the exception of 2 years, clearly that's bad debt. And that's a bad approach to a deficit. But you have to decide how important is it for us to balance our revenues and expenditures. At the federal level, over the past 4 decades, it has not been important at all for us to balance our revenues. Then there's the implementation cluster, which talks about decisions made in implementing these policies and these programs that are incorporated within our public budget. The decisions that administrators make on a daily basis in terms of how do we implement these programs, what are the guidance, what are the rules and regulations that will govern the implementation of these programs. The decisions we make about how we implement these programs and policies will have implications for budgeting as well. If we implement them one way, it may cost us more money than if we implement them another way. So there's a lot of different areas or clusters in which we will make these types of decisions. So since public budgeting is all about decision-making, we need to have some good decision-making models that we can use to determine how we're going to make our decisions in the public budgeting process. And in all my courses, I always introduce my classes to 4 different decision-making models. Whether it's in my 500 class or in this class, there are 4 basic decision-making models that we tend to use in policymaking, including policymaking in the world of budgeting. And some of these you're familiar with. The first one is rational comprehensive. In rational comprehensive decision-making, we're going to take into account all the available information, analyze that information, and then put together a full range of alternatives, and then select the best one as our policy. And then that best alternative then gets included in our public budget. Clearly, we would like to be rational in everything that we do, but we have limitations. We have what Herb Simon calls bounded rationality and cognitive limitations. There's only so much information we can acquire. There's only so much information we can assimilate and we can understand. So chances are in budgeting, we are never going to be purely rational in the way in which we make our decisions. Rather, it's the second decision-making model of incrementalism that tends to carry the day in budgeting. Most of our budgets are based upon incremental decision-making. We'll make small changes in what we're spending from one year to the next. There are a couple of reasons for that. One reason why we tend to be incremental in our budgeting decision-making is because of the types of budgets that we use. We typically tend to use what are called line item budgets. In a line item budget, we will list, here is what we're spending the money on, and here is the amount of money we're spending. So in a line item budget, the only information you get is what the money is being spent on and how much money is being spent. But clearly, if you're only getting information on what you're spending the money on and how much money you're spending, you're not getting a whole lot of information to be more rational. You're not getting any information about how effective these programs are. You're not getting information on the actual activities we're engaging in implementing these programs. You have none of that information to go on. So if the only information you have is what you're spending the money on and how much money you spent last year, that's all the information you have to go on. You're going to probably just make very small changes from one year to the next. So look at what we spent last year and we'll add on 2 or 3%. So incremental decision-making really is the primary decision-making model we tend to see used in public budgeting. But a third possible decision-making model is what's called mixed scanning. Mixed scanning tries to combine the best of both worlds. It tries to combine rational decision-making with incrementalism. It says for our big decisions, we will be rational. For our smaller decisions, we'll be more incremental. So if we're making a decision about a new program or a new policy, we want to be as rational as possible. Collect as much information as possible before determining what activities we're going to fund and how much money we're going to spend on those activities. If it's something much more mundane, such as the amount of supplies that we're buying for an office from one year to the next, we can be more incremental. So rational for big issues, incremental for small issues. The problem obviously is a subjective one. What is big for one person may be a small issue for another person and vice versa. A fourth decision-making model that I always like to talk about, especially in my policy class, is the garbage can model of decision-making. And I think it has applicability here in public budgeting as well. In the garbage can model of decision-making, decisions tend to be made at the confluence of 4 different streams: the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, and what's called the choice opportunity stream. In the participant stream, in order to make a decision, we have to have decision makers who are predisposed to make a decision about this issue. So an example of that could be in the 1990s with welfare reform. We got major welfare reform because we had a Republican majority in Congress and a Democratic president who both defined the welfare problem kind of in a similar way, in that the welfare problem was that it was a self-perpetuating system, and it made it difficult for people to move from welfare to work. And there weren't real incentives for states to move people from welfare to work. So you had people in place who were predisposed to making a decision. Then you have what's called a problem stream. You've got all these problems that are floating around out there. If you've had the policy class, you've talked about John Kingdom, you talked about his problem stream. And they've got all these problems out there that society is aware of. One of those problems needs to be clearly defined enough to make it onto the decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. Once that issue makes it onto the decision-making agenda, that's when we can then generate solutions to address that problem. Which then speaks to the third stream, which is the solution stream. The solution stream says that there are a myriad of solutions out there that could possibly be applied to solve this problem we're trying to solve. Those solutions may pre-exist the problem. And the example again with welfare reform was the solution that was going to be used for welfare reform, which was to try and move people from welfare to work, was the use of what's called a block grant. we'll talk later on the term about block grants, but a block grant is a general grant of money from the federal government to either state or local governments that provides a lot of flexibility for state and local governments in specifically how they spend that money. So we'll provide a block grant, a temporary assistance to needy family grant to state governments and tell them you must use this money to move people from welfare to work. However, what you specifically spend the money on is left up to you. So if you want to spend the money on childcare programs or job training programs or computer literacy programs, that's up to you, as long as what you're spending the money on helps to move people from welfare into gainful employment. And so how you spend it is up to you. That's a block grant. Block grants have been around for decades before welfare reform in the 1990s. We took a solution from a pre-existing generation and applied it to a contemporary problem. And then you need to have a choice opportunity. You need to have some type of a triggering event, a window of opportunity that opens up that makes it possible to make a new policy on this issue. And so the example I always use when I teach policy is the example of the Value Jet 582 crash back in the 1990s. And this plane that crashed in the Florida Everglades, the reason why it crashed in the Florida Everglades is because there's a fire that broke out in the cargo bay of the plane. There were no smoke detectors required in cargo bay of planes at that time. So by the time the crew knew about the fire, it was too late, burned through the electrical system. And unfortunately, the plane crashed. I believe it led to the death of, I think, 193 passengers. And so it was a huge airline disaster. That huge airline disaster was a triggering event that then caused decision makers to require the placement of smoke detectors into the cargo bay of planes. So in a garbage can model decision making, all four of these streams, if you will, all flow together at the confluence of those streams. That tends to be where we make decisions in policy. Well, here's your so what question again. Well, so what? So we got these four different decision-making models. What does that then mean for how we put our public budgets together? The type of decision-making model that we use will then result in a different type of budget. If we're using an incremental type of decision-making, chances are we're going to end up creating what we call a line item or an object of expenditure budget. However, if we want to use a more rational approach to decision-making, that more rational decision-making will probably necessitate a more rational type of budget, such as a program-based, a performance-based, or a zero-based type of budget. So the decision-making model we use will have profound implications on how we put our budgets together. So hold on to these four different decision-making models, because we're going to return to this information in future classes when we talk about different budget formats and why we create our budgets the way in which we do. So just this kind of background information for you to hold on to. Next week, when we get into our discussion of budget formats in the second half of class, we're going to reach back to these decision-making models, and we will then apply them to our understanding of our four different budget formats that we'll talk about next week. And I see we are completely out of time, and that's right at the right moment, because that finishes up all of our information in terms of the background information on the public finance and budgeting. Again, just kind of get everyone on the same page, regardless of how you satisfied your prerequisite with either a microeconomics course here at Long Beach or one at a community college or a PPA 518. This is the type of information that you get from that class. So we just want to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what are public budgets, why do we have public budgets, what makes public budgets different than private sector budgets, and then kind of how we make our decisions as we put these public budgets together. This will then set the stage then for next week. And next week in the first half of class, we'll start really getting into the nuts and bolts of the budgeting process at the federal as well as the state and local level. And then we'll, in the second half of class, get into the nuts and bolts of what budgets look like and the different types of budgets that we can create. Now, I'll take you through some examples of those four main budget formats. Again, I know we're out of time, but any quick questions about any of this preliminary foundational information from tonight? Okay. If not, thank you for being here. I will get this recording up on our Canvas site by tomorrow morning. Please remember, do post your introduction no later than next Monday at midnight. Then we'll be back together again next Tuesday, talking about budget processes and budget formats. Any questions at all of the class or the requirements, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email. Happy to answer your questions that you may have. I look forward to working with everyone over the next few weeks, and I hope you have a good night, a good week, and I'll talk to you again then next Tuesday. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.